Okay. Yeah. Then I would say just let's start. And yeah. Just turn it off. Okay, yeah. My name is Andre, and I will do this and the next session about executive functions, as the topic says. Okay, let's start with some introduction into executive functions. And the best thing to start is with the definition of the term we are talking about. However, with executive functions, it's a little bit tricky and a little bit different because there are no real proper widely accepted definitions. So this is merely an attempt of a definition which should give you some idea. And that says that executive functions are basically mental processes for the management, that means the regulation and control of other cognitive processes, in particular in relation to complex actions. And we'll see an example of that in a moment. And there are a couple of synonyms, well, more or less, because some people use these other terms in a synonymous way. Some other research would say, well, these are not real synonyms, they represent slightly different aspects of this concept. And so some people don't say executive functions, but instead executive processes, or you may say executive control processes, control functions. Controlled attention sometimes is used to refer to a roughly overlapping or the same concept. Then central executive system, CES, of the Baddeley working memory model, and the supervisory attentional system, according to the Norman and Shellis model. We will talk about these things later in more detail and their relation to that. Okay, let's have an example. When we talk about coordination of task processing in complex actions, what does that mean? So let's start with a simple action. In a simple action, maybe, let's take the example of cooking, that you want to have peeled potatoes as your goal, and you start out with unpeeled potatoes. So simple, straightforward solution to that would be we just peel the potatoes. Straightforward, it's easy, not much to coordinate. As a complex action, let's take the example of preparing a potato gratin. And here we may have a couple of steps to do until we reach our final goal. So we may have to start with peeling the potatoes, then we cut them into slices, then we may have to pre-boil them so that they're well done when they come out of the oven. And this pre-boiling takes some time, and when they are done, we put that into the casserole before it goes into the oven. During that time, we can switch and do another task in between. For instance, grating the cheese, which comes on top of that. And finally, we put then the cheese on the potatoes and put it into the oven. Now, what may happen is that while we are grating the cheese, the potatoes are boiling over. So we have to stop that action, change the action we are actually attending to, take care of the overboiling potatoes, and then, once we have taken care of that, return to grating the cheese. So here, for this type of action, it's assumed that we heavily need so-called executive functions to control this type of action. So, for instance, we have to sequence the actions. It's highly advisable to first peel and then cut into slices. Otherwise, it's a very tedious work to peel every single slice of potatoes. We have to monitor what's going on to be aware of the fact that potatoes are cooking over. We have multitasking. That means we have to do basically two things at the same time. We have to switch between two tasks. We may have to inhibit one task to be able to switch quickly to another task, which is more important at the moment. And there are further things not directly evident in this schematic illustration, like a more global planning, like the decision to do a gratin at all in the first place, and that we may need some ingredients and have to go shopping for that. And we are able to incorporate some feedback, so that we say, okay, next time maybe a little bit less salt would have done better, so that we can incorporate that in future actions. So in all these different aspects are thought to be subsumed under the heading of executive functions. So a little bit more specific, tailored down to more cognitive experimental tasks, one could say that some of the core executive functions or tasks is first executive attention. That means that with attention we select what we need to do to achieve our goal. Task switching, moving our executive attention between tasks, like with the potatoes and the grating cheese. We need inhibition. When we are really involved in grating the cheese, we may need to inhibit that actively to be able to switch over to taking care of our goals. Planning, like the sequencing of activities, and monitoring that our performance is correct. Okay, why are they called executive? And that's basically pretty much an analogy to a CEO, a chief executive officer in companies. So the role of these executive processes is basically that they manage the task processing without actually being involved in the task performance itself. It's like the manager of a company manages the ongoings in his company without being actually in the production line producing the product itself. So in other words, we are talking about separate processes which are independent of the basic cognitive processes doing the task. They're hierarchically on a higher level. Okay, so where does the concept originate from? That's a little bit hard to say again, because there were different trends emerging at the same time. The concept has been mentioned under different names before, but probably one of the strongest sources where it comes from, basically, or where people attribute it to, is the working memory model of Alan Baddeley, who is probably one of the most important cognitive psychologists of our time. And you probably know the Baddeley working memory model with the phonological articulatory loop and the visual spatial sketchpad. And yeah, he's really very widely known, you know, as a normal, everyday researcher. You write your research papers, and sometimes one way to assess how well you do in your research is to look how often have you been cited in your research. So normal researchers are often happy when they are cited 20, 30 times or something. And the seminal papers by Baddeley are often cited in the range of a couple of thousand times. So they're really influential for a wide variety of research. And in 1974, Baddeley and his colleague Hitch, they proposed this working memory model. And I'm sure you're familiar with that, so we just go through that quickly. But it arose initially from the idea that there are different short-term memory storage systems. So one for auditory memory, which they termed phonological loop, which enables us, for instance, if somebody tells us their phone number, to memorize that by repeating it mentally. And the same in the visual domain, visual spatial sketchpad. Later, in around the year 2000, he proposed an additional component called the episodic buffer, which kind of links these contents with long-term memory and episodic memory. And the new influential idea of that working memory model for our lecture here is that Baddeley and Hitch proposed a central executive system which kind of coordinates and manages these three subsystems. And the one line of research where he suggested that there is such a thing like that is that he used quite a bit of what has been termed dual task performance. So people did either tasks using the phonological loop by itself or the visual spatial sketch by themselves, and then they had to do two tasks at the same time. And he had patients which were able to do either task by themselves fine, but when it came to concurrent task performance broke down. So he assumed there must be some additional executive managing component which coordinates task processing. So the functions of the central executive system in this model is to maintain information, update and monitor the information in short-term memory, and generally said to regulate the flow of information in these buffers. Okay, I said it's hard to find a generally accepted clear-cut definition of executive functions. And one reason is, or one complicating thing is that people from quite a few of different areas of research use that term. And so it's just helpful probably to keep in mind when you read about executive functions, what's the background of the people of the research talking about that. So there are the people coming from the memory research, in particular working memory domain. And when they talk about executive functions, it is often linked to storage, to management of memory contents. Then you have the people who come more from the research, how do we act, how do we control our actions. And they refer with executive functions more to the concept of how do we manage task processing. So pretty much like the example with the cooking. Then we have researchers which come from a physiological perspective, neuroanatomy. So they look at certain brain areas and try to find out, okay, this particular brain area, what function does it have? And when they say, okay, this particular brain area has a function which we would call executive function, and this brain area has some other functions as well, then these might be considered executive also. And finally, from the view of neuropsychology, so what are the syndromes where we have damage to certain brain areas and what arises by that. Okay, with that, let's turn to the neuroanatomy side of executive functions. So, I want to give a very broad and simplified overview of how the brain is organized in terms of information processing. And this is really simplistic, but you could say that vision is basically processed in the occipital mode, the back of the brain. And you usually have a gradient in these perceptual systems. So information arriving at the cortex is processed in primary sensory areas. And in vision, that's basically the cells process something, okay, there's a dot of light. Then you have secondary cortices. They detect edges and so forth. So you go further up in the hierarchy and it becomes more and more abstract, the information. Same holds for hearing. Auditory information is processed in the temporal lobes, in this area, auditory cortex. And you have the sensation of touch, somatosensation, which is here in the anterior parietal lobe. And this information is processed further and further abstract, and then is bound together in some areas, like such a higher association area in the temporal-parietal occipital junction, where then sometimes these sensations are bound together and are made very abstract. Then you have a very sharp line of delineation here, and that is the central sulcus. And the central sulcus is really interesting in a way that it is a very deep sulcus in the human brain, and its shape and structure is rather invariant across participants. For instance, it makes a typical shape or curve at the place where the hands are represented. So you can go just into an anatomical image of a brain and say, okay, there is the representation of the hands, because you have such a good mapping of the function to the anatomy. So we have on the posterior end, to the back of the central cyclus, we have the incoming information from our senses, touch, pain, these things. And anterior to that, we have the motor areas. And it's really at the fundus, at the bottom of the sulcus, that the neurons change from one step to the other. You have neurons projecting down, and you have neurons coming up. And such a clear division rarely occurs in the brain. Usually you have rather smoother transitions. Okay, so with this distinction here, you could say in a simplified manner that the back of the brain is mainly related to the perception, to the processing of incoming information, while everything frontal to this line is somehow related to coordination of movement or to action. So what happens is that all these areas on direct or indirect routes all project to the so-called lateral prefrontal cortex, which is this area. So this area of the brain has access to information of all our senses. Therefore, it has been theoretically and by evidence, research evidence, linked to executive functions. In addition, this area, the lateral prefrontal cortex, gets input about our emotional state from the limbic system and about our body states, how hungry we are, things like that, from more subcortical systems. So in a way, this lateral prefrontal cortex is in the perfect position to decide what's our next best move, what's our next best action to take, because it gathers all the information from everywhere. Once a decision is taken, what we will do, then this cortex has efferents, that means can influence the motor areas via premotor cortex and then primary motor cortex. And here you have kind of a gradient as well, which runs the opposite way. Here we said we start with the most low-level basic feature and go more abstract. Here we have the most low-level feature in the primary motor cortex. If you stimulate by an electrode single neurons in the primary motor cortex, you will get dedicated muscle switches. So every area is really linked to a single muscle to control movement. When you go a little bit more anterior, you are in the premotor cortex. Here, when you stimulate single neurons, you don't get dedicated muscle switches, but very weird movements. So movement control is more abstract in a way that you need an ensemble of neurons to create coherent movement. However, you have a very high flexibility here. So you have an intermediate stage. And the further you go anterior, the more abstract the representation of movement and action becomes. While at the most anterior end, you are at concepts of social cognition, social behavior, and things like that. So where you really are on the highest level of abstraction. Okay, so the essential take-home message here is executive functions are most likely localized in the lateral prefrontal cortex, because that area has access to all information needed to make decisions and has the power to actually influence our actions and movements. Okay, so taking a step back, the localization of these functions in the brain. So how do we describe that a little bit more specific than just saying lateral prefrontal cortex? Has been brought forward quite a bit by a person called Corbinian-Brodmann, and this was quite a while ago, as you can see, roughly 100 years. And what he has done is that he took a human brain and divided it or categorized it by cytoarchitectonics. This is Brodmann, and this is an example. So this is a section through the cortex. So this is the gray matter, so to say, and then white matter below that. And when you do that, look at the cortex at different areas in the brain, you will see that the structure is very different with respect to what type of cells. Here are large pyramidal cells, here are much more smaller cells, how are they organized in layers and things like that. So, and he just said, okay, we have a homogeneous area here where all structure looks like this, and then it changes to another area. And that's what he mapped in such a map. So this may look quite weird and the projection is not too big, but every different type of hatching or points notes a different area. Here is the central sulcus, so these dots here are Brodmann area 4, it's primary motor cortex. These open circles are Brodmann area 6, premotor cortex, for instance. And the numbering, by the way, doesn't follow any system, doesn't make any sense. It's just the way the sequence he dissected or investigated. So Brodmann area 1 is just the first area he looked at, which is none of that. So don't try to find a system in there. You won't find one. Okay. Why do I put some emphasis on this is that although it's that old, still in virtually every neuroimaging paper you will read, when people make references to anatomical areas, they still use these Brodmann areas for description. So it is still the primary way to describe that, be more specific about that. This is just a different map. The other one was Brodmann's original map. This is more nicely colored. And so when we talk about executive functions, then you could say the primary areas which have been linked to executive functions are Brodmann area 46 and Brodmann area 9. These two areas. Quite a few additional areas frequently has been associated with executive functions as well, but not as frequently as these two areas. So for instance, Brodmann area 8, which contained the frontal eye fields as well, Brodmann area 10, frontal polar cortex, very far anterior end of the brain, then 44, which is Broca's area, basically speech production involved in that. So you see that we have a focus here on the lateral prefrontal cortex in the center, but the surrounding areas are often associated as well. Okay, so let's take a slight step back again and look at more comprehensive theories of this area. How is it structured? How it is organized? That prefrontal cortex. And I would like to talk about two theories. One is the so-called process-based theory. And this has been put forward mainly by Michael Petridis and Adrian Owen. And it says, okay, the functions within the lateral prefrontal cortex can be subdivided neuroanatomically and functionally by a distinction based on the mental process which goes on. And they say the manipulation of memory content is localized differently as compared to, oh, not manipulation versus manipulation, it should be manipulation versus maintenance. So the pure upkeeping of information or the working with the information. So an example would be, if I give you my phone number to remember, and you keep that in your head, then this is pure maintenance. However, when I then say, oh, I'm sorry, I mixed up the last two letters, please switch them, then this would be manipulation of the memory content. So you have to do actively something with that. An alternative approach, and these two are not directly compatible with each other, so it's really a bit of a question of either or, is the so-called content-based theory, mainly put forward by Patricia Goldman-Rakish. And she says that the distinction is basically based on the content. That means whether the content I have to work with in my working memory is spatial or whether it's object memory. Okay, let's look at these theories in more detail. So the process-based theory mainly put forward Adrian Owen. He's now in Canada, Western University. For a long time he has been in Cambridge. And Michael Tretides, he is also in Canada. He is director of the Montreal Neurological Institute, the MNI, which is quite a big and well-regarded institute in the area of neuroscience. And for instance, when you see MRI analysis studies, then often, for instance, they report the coordinates of where they found brain activation in the so-called MNI space. And that derives from the fact that this institute has published a reference space based on like 150 brain anatomies, which is now widely used. Okay, so the process-based theory. Let's have a look at the human lateral prefrontal cortex in a very schematic way. And so the idea is that here you have areas 9, 46, some transition area, 46 and 9, here's area 8, 45. And the lateral prefrontal cortex is subdivided. And it's subdivided by at least 2 horizontal cell sites. It's a superior frontal sulcus and the inferior frontal sulcus. Below the inferior frontal sulcus, you have 45, you have Broca, you have speech areas. And here in the superior frontal sulcus, you have the frontal eye fields, posterior and frontal area. Okay, so, and they define dorsolateral prefrontal cortex as everything which is up or dorsal superior of the inferior frontal sulcus. So all the shaded area is dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and all this light gray area is ventral lateral prefrontal cortex. So everything below the inferior frontal sulcus. They say that the dorsolateral PFC is mainly for the manipulation of information in working memory, while the ventrolateral PFC is for the maintenance of information in working memory without further processing. Okay. There is quite an support for that coming from animal studies where monkeys have been investigated, and in different ways, sometimes ablation studies, that means you induce lesions, sometimes only temporarily by cooling down the cortex, sometimes permanently by just destroying the cortex, or by cellular cortex. However, one of the very big problems is that the monkey brain is organized slightly differently. And one of the main differences is that you only have one horizontal sulcus, the so-called principal sulcus. So, up to date, it is totally unclear which of these 2 sulci is the respective sulcus for comparison. And in the animal literature, which is somewhat older than the human literature, dorsolateral is easy to define as everything which is above the principal sulcus, and ventrolateral everything which is down. So it's quite hard to relate animal studies and human studies directly to each other, because it is not quite clear where the line has to be drawn. And I know of a very well-regarded neurologist who would, for instance, argue, well, it is neither here nor here, but it's in between. Because approximately 30% of all humans have actually a third sulcus, which is called an intermediate frontal sulcus. It doesn't mean anything, it doesn't make you any smarter or something, it's just a thing of how the brain is structured. And his idea is, well, it's probably along that line where the distinction between dorsal and ventral prefrontal cortex lies. So this is just to make you sensitive to that it is actually not that clear-cut if people say, well, yeah, we found something in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and it's just here. One might question that. Okay, so what evidence is there in support of this process-based theory? As I said, there are lesion studies with monkey showing that if you lesion the dorsal part, they can't do manipulation anymore, but they can quite well maintain information, and vice versa. Lesion studies with humans, of course you don't induce lesions, but you take patients with acquired brain injury, and neuroimaging studies. So this is a very early PET study by Owen and Petridis from 1996, so really when the whole imaging thing started. And so what these authors have done is basically that they had two tasks. One task was maintenance only, and the other one was maintenance plus manipulation, and that was a so-called span task. And the working memory span task is quite a difficult one. So there are different versions. The probably oldest is the so-called reading span. And for the reading span task, what you have to do is you have to read a sentence and you have to remember the last word of that sentence. You read the next sentence and you have to remember the last word of that sentence as well. And then you read a couple of sentences and then you are required and asked to just reproduce each last word of the sentences, and to make it even more difficult, in the order of their presentation. So you have to say the first word presented first, and so forth. In the pure maintenance condition, what you do is you just get a list of words, which you have to remember, and here you have to do the other stuff. There's other versions of that span task, for instance, the operation span task, which is you're blinded by the sun to yeah. Maybe that helps, I don't know. Does it help? Okay. Thank you. For instance, the operation span task, you have to do mathematical operations. 3 plus 5 divided by 2 equals, and then you get two choices, right or wrong, and then you get a letter to remember. And then you get the next math equation and the next letter, and then you have to reproduce the letters. It's really quite demanding task. And they've done these type of tasks, and what they were able to show, if you do only maintenance, you get the inferior lateral prefrontal cortex as activation. And if you do both, so you have maintenance and manipulation, the span task, you get two activation peaks, one in the inferior or ventrolateral prefrontal cortex and one in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Okay. So the process-based theory says that in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex you have the manipulation of information. In addition, the monitoring of information, so monitoring tasks activate the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex as well. Executive functions and working memory, and it's not content dependent. So when you have to memorize, only maintain something, either spatial or object, it's ventral, and if you have to manipulate something, no matter whether it's spatial or object, it's dorsal. That's the idea. And the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex is for the maintenance and retrieval of information, and by this it has been associated with the auditory loop and the visual spatial sketchpad according to the Badling model. Okay, let's turn to the second theory, the content-based theory of the lateral prefrontal cortex. The main proponent has been Patricia Goldman-Rakish, who passed away, unfortunately, in 2003 due to a car accident. And she was extremely well-known figure in research. She was an absolute